tend to be introspective and backward-looking. As you heard from Mr. Logan today and Ms. DeVoe, we must look to the future. And Ms. Johnson recommended we look beyond our own shores. And as we do look for those best practices, let's look forward and at large. I recommend to the committee today the successful experience of 3 republics, democracies like our own, with the future of voting technology, which you heard hinted at today, which is online voting. In the city of Mexico City, they conducted the first online binding election in Latin America. Now, this was 20% of the overseas vote were counted by online methods, where in over 951 cities across 98 countries, Mexican expatriates were able to vote in that election. And that was done in July of 2012. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs introduced online voting for French citizens abroad in 2009. And at that time, 8.7% of those who voted by that online method for the expatriates. By 2013, 65.5% voted by that method. So it continues to grow as they have confidence in the system. And in Norway, the Ministry of Local Governments and Regional Development did a number of pilot programs since about 2010 on online voting, and now has gone to full online voting for their municipal elections, and they're moving to their federal level in those elections. So the technology has been demonstrated and is proved to be adequate to the task. Now, what these countries didn't experience is the 2 steps backwards we took in 2000. And we are necessarily reflexively cautious in this, and ought to be. But as we listen to the discussions about the security of these means of voting, let's also take into account what you are hearing. We're being told we don't really know. Well, we have plenty of academics to look at this. Let's really know. And as we also look at the huge expenditures we're going to make, a $4,000 DRE is an expensive piece of single-use equipment. An iPad at $400 certainly seems to make more sense. Now, these were just 3 of the 18 countries that are involved in this process now. And it's time for us to begin the dialogue in this country so that we don't find ourselves somewhere down the line still hanging on to our antiquated systems. And one final comment. If you wanted to understand best practices in NASCAR, you'd go talk to the drivers and the pit crew, and you'd go talk to those super fans who keep all the stats in the stands. But you'd probably also want to go talk to the guys that make the cars. So I would presume to recommend to the commission that you talk to people in the industry, the elections industry, because there's an awful lot of us who've been working this for a long time. And many of us, like myself, have background as an election official and as a UOCAVA voter. And so I think there's something that we can add to that. Now, in the event that you don't change your schedule and bring an industry to talk to you, I would suggest that when you go to visit Commissioner Brighton's facility, where you can really see how long lines are handled very well, you slide down I-4 down to the other end of the I-4 corridor to Hillsborough County, Tampa, and come and see us, and we can talk to you about elections modernization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan. Elena Nunez.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Elena Nunez. I'm the Executive Director of Colorado Common Cause. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works for open and accountable government and to increase participation in the political process. We also, since 2004, have led a coalition of nonpartisan organizations committed to protecting the right to vote. That's known as Just Vote Colorado Election Protection. The goal of that program is to ensure that every eligible voter here in Colorado who wants to vote is able to do so, and that every vote that is cast is counted accurately. Our coalition has nonpartisan poll monitors at polling locations throughout the state. We host a website with voting information. We staff a bilingual call center, and we take the information that we learn to work with election administrators to resolve problems that we identify. Through this work over the last 9 years, we've talked to thousands of voters throughout the state and heard about many of the challenges that they experience when voting. In the 2012 general election, we identified significant barriers to voting here in the state. On the first panel this morning, you heard from Mr. Trout about the benefits of all vote by mail and Ms. Oliver about the benefits of vote centers. Colorado's election law brings together the best elements of both of those processes to create maximum opportunity for voter participation. Danetta Davidson provided a great overview of how the new law works. I want to comment just briefly on what that means for voters and how it creates increased access to resolve problems we've seen in the past. In 2012, the greatest problem that we saw from voters was confusion about mail balloting. While mail balloting was popular in Colorado, the increased use was leading to increased confusion. Some elections were held exclusively by mail, so in some elections voters got ballots automatically, and others they didn't. Some voters who opted to permanently receive mail ballots by not voting were then taken off that list. We saw increased confusion leading to the greatest number of calls coming from voters who wanted to know where their ballot was or why they got one when they weren't expecting it. Colorado's new law provides the consistency that's required for voters by sending every voter a ballot automatically who has a good address. But importantly, voters still have the option to vote in person. And this is something that's come up a few times this morning and this afternoon from both clerks and others. But I think it's important to remember that for many voters, they like voting in person. Whether it's because they want to vote on an accessible voting machine, they like that feeling of being in their community. Whatever the reason, it's important to have opportunities for voters to participate in person. We've also seen, and the data shows, that many voters who do vote that mail ballot prefer to drop it off. They don't want to mail it back. They want to know that it gets where it's going. So having a system that has in-person options plus drop-off locations is important to meet voter needs. The second issue that we saw last year relates to voter registration and confusion about registration. And unfortunately, this is a problem that was significant in 2012, but it's been significant every year since we've started this program. Voters who move and don't update their information or mistakenly believe that they are registered are then disenfranchised if they don't take action quickly enough. Colorado's taken great strides to address this issue with the implementation of online voter registration, the use of national change of address data to update voter information, and the establishment of these voter service centers where voters who aren't registered can register to vote through Election Day. We've taken significant opportunities to allow all voters, both those who are currently registered and those who have not yet registered, to participate in our elections. The third issue that we saw that was significant had to do with confusion around identification requirements for voting. And this came up previously in the last panel as well. Colorado has an expansive, relatively speaking, ID law, but we got calls from voters throughout the state who were told when they showed up to vote that they needed to show a photo ID, even though that wasn't the case. I think there are two pieces to learn from this experience. The first is that it's important that we maintain options for voting and identification related to voting so that all voters are able to participate, even those who don't have or cannot get a state-issued ID. The second is that poll worker training is critically important to make sure that when voters go to the polls, they get accurate information. What we know is that the experience that the voter has when they go to vote really drives both their confidence in the process and their satisfaction and trust in the system. So making sure that voters have a good experience is critically important. We've taken great strides here in Colorado to improve the quality of our elections, and I think there are some good practices that can be used as models for other states. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Next is John Schmidt.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. What are the most important principles that America stands for? What is it that makes us proud to be Americans? Isn't it our freedom and our equality? I am the president of Five Cedar Group that developed the Oregon alternate format ballot system 6 years ago. I'm very proud that we've helped provide an easy and secure means for our state voters who would otherwise have difficulty voting. As Americans, we're proud to live in a democracy in which we're free to vote. But is the slogan, one person, one vote, a reality for everyone? Can the most vulnerable of our citizens really vote without being subjected to unrealistic physical demands? Imagine that you're 45 and have developed macular degeneration, or you're 75 and the painful arthritis in your hips has put you in a wheelchair. Now imagine how you're going to get to the polls. And by the way, it's a rainy, cold day in November. In 1968, while on a business trip, my father was in a car accident that left him a quadriplegic for 27 years. My siblings and I know firsthand the challenges that a family has to transport somebody in a wheelchair to a particular place at a particular day. For us able-bodied to assume that we serve the needs of the disabled because there's one accessible voting machine at a polling place is not to understand the sometimes heroic efforts it takes to get them there. And it doesn't have to be that way. My dad did have use of his arms, and using 2 sticks velcroed to his palms, he got quite proficient in pecking out engaging letters on his trusty IBM Selectric. Now, that was 20 years ago. Today, my neighbor Dave, who fell off his roof just a year and a half ago, takes pictures of his kids with his smartphone and posts them on Facebook. The difference between hunt and pecking and having gestures, he can do the gestures, okay? People with disabilities are using PCs and mobile devices in their everyday lives. We can and should leverage their existing capabilities and their strengths to make it easier for them to vote. At the EAC's Accessible Voting Conference back in April, an attendee commented that going to the polls to vote, like everyone else, gives voters with disability a sense of dignity and self-worth. That may be true for some, but is it everyone's reality? Last November, after waiting several hours to vote, a blind woman, Lisa Maria Martinez, was asked to walk to a second polling place because the accessible machine at her polling place didn't work. How much dignity and respect do you think she felt? Enough that she and 4 other plaintiffs are suing Alameda County. Having the right to vote should not mean you have the right to stand in line for hours or being told you can't vote at this polling place. How would you feel if that was you? Commissioners, I came to Denver today to ask your help to put better reality into our nation's elections. The Uniformed Overseas and Citizens Absentee Voting Act, UOCAVA, as well as the Defense Department's FFAP, MOVE, and EASE programs, have made it easy for the military and overseas voters to vote. We've given our soldiers extra time to fill out their ballots. They can mail them back, they can fax them back, and this act and these programs have made their right to vote a reality, but only for UOCAVA voters. Since these programs work, let's extend the rules for participation. I'm asking that you strongly recommend that the rules for UOCAVA be expanded and its benefits be made available to anyone who needs additional assistance. Commissioners, there's no doubt that poll workers work very hard and really do want everyone to vote. But if the equipment provided is difficult to set up, if the election budgets are being cut, and with the limited number of voting days, poll workers are fighting a losing battle. In Oregon, we email HTML ballots, we mail large format 18-point ballots to voters who request them. Interesting, last November, the age range for our large format ballots was 29 to 103. That's pretty cool. Your recommendation could empower people with disabilities to vote on the digital devices they already have and use on a daily basis. Expanding the rules to cover voters with disabilities will help make our elections free, fair, and accessible for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Carol Tone, hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Thank you, Commission members, for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Carol Tone, and I follow voting rights for the League of Women Voters of Colorado. The League is a nonpartisan political organization that works to improve government and public policy through citizen education and advocacy. The right of every citizen to vote has been a basic League principle since its origin 93 years ago. We applaud the Presidential Commission on Election Administration for seeking to determine nonpartisan ways to shorten lines, promote efficient conduct of elections, and provide better access to the polls for all voters. The League actively opposes voter suppression legislation, which may be in the form of requiring restrictive photo ID requirements on eligible voters which block them from voting, restricting the conduct of independent voter registration drives, shortening or eliminating early voting, purging the rolls, the voter rolls, by election officials, elimination of election day registration, unfair targeting of students. On the positive side, the Colorado League of Women Voters commends Colorado for easing strain on election workers and ensuring successful process for voters, including establishing, enhancing, and maintaining a statewide voter registration system, encouraging online voter registration, shortening the time for registering prior to an election, mailing ballots to all active eligible voters, creating voter service and polling centers in all counties, which will be open for 15 days prior to an election, that is, in a general election, allowing election day registration, offering the voter various means of casting a ballot in an all-mail ballot election, from voting by mail to dropping it off at drop-off locations, and to vote in person at voter centers and polling centers. The League would like to see minimal need for the use of provisional ballots. All attempts to provide clean voter rolls in ways that are transparent, accurate, and legal. Assurance that resources and training are fairly distributed to all polling places. Through election administration reforms, we seek to make our democracy as free, fair, and accessible as possible for all eligible voters. Thank you.
Thank you. James Tucker.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is James Tucker. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Wilson Elser in Commissioner Lomax's community in Las Vegas. I work as outside counsel with the Native American Rights Fund, largely doing litigation on language cases, and I'm an adjunct professor at UNLV's Boyd School of Law when I'm not litigating. I'm going to focus largely on language minority voters, and those are basically those voters who tend to be left out or left behind. And the data shows that from the 2012 presidential election. I've actually provided several attachments with my written submission. But just to summarize it, the data shows that Asian and Latino citizens of voting age turned out at a rate of approximately 15 to 16% below non-Hispanic whites. Alaska Natives, over 20% below. And American Indians, depending on the state, New Mexico about anywhere from 7 to 10% below, parts of Arizona as much as 30% below. So what my attachments to my written statement show highlight the impact. They highlight worst practices because I think before you can get to best practices, you have to see when a jurisdiction does bad things and learn from that. And I provided that in the form of the complaint that we just filed in Alaska a couple of weeks ago. And then the best practices, I've summarized in my statement, but I've also provided a article that I wrote with, I co-authored with Dr. Rudolfo Espino at Arizona State University, and that was submitted in support of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006. It was the largest nationwide study of its kind of jurisdictions covered for language assistance, and that provides, again, some of the best practices. Why should you care about this? 60% of all the states are covered in whole or in part by the language assistance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And of that, 3 states are covered in their entirety, 248 county-level jurisdictions. 66 million Americans live in jurisdictions covered by Section 203, and approximately 10% of those are limited English proficient citizens of voting age. The underlying theme that I want to talk about very quickly in terms of best practices is that election officials need to strive to provide for language minority voters the exact same access that English-speaking voters have. And to get there, what you need to do is basically 3 things: complete, accurate, and uniform translations for all voting activities, from registration, deadlines, all the way up through Election Day. I'm going to get through 15 best practices in bullet point form. I've identified it, I've elaborated on the points a lot more in my written statement, so I will try to keep it within the 2 minutes and 40 seconds that I've left. Number one, identify the language needs of the covered group, which are going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The only way you can do that is to ask the voters and to have folks actively going out and seeking that information from the voters. Make language assistance the same priority as other election requirements. That's something that consistently across the board we've seen election officials fail. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes they just don't know any better, sometimes they are just completely understaffed and don't have the resources. Number three, language assistance needs to be proactive and not reactive or passive. And what I mean by that is that poll workers need to affirmatively reach out to the voters in their native language when they come in to vote. They can't wait for a voter to ask for it because far too often the voter won't, and they won't be aware that they can get assistance in their native language. To get to that point, number four, use a bilingual coordinator. And I know many of you have language coverage in your jurisdictions, and you probably do use bilingual coordinators. And what those coordinators do are they develop and implement the language program, they train election officials, they recruit and train poll workers, they do outreach to community organizations, and they confirm the language abilities of the poll workers, which is a huge issue. Number five, recruit and train bilingual poll workers with the assistance of local organizations. And again, I've got more details on that. Number six, it doesn't do any good if you have bilingual poll workers in the polls if they aren't actually bilingual and fluent in both English and the covered language. And far too many jurisdictions just accept the voters or the poll workers' word that they're bilingual. They need to confirm the abilities. Seven, you have to provide prepared written translations in the language even if you're giving oral assistance. It's the only way you can ensure that a voter is getting the same translation regardless of which polling precinct they happen to walk into. Number eight, translate all voting materials and confirm they are accurate. The only way you can do that is if you reach out to the organizations and voters and actually see whether or not they can understand the materials before you put them out on election day. Number nine, train bilingual poll workers, including not just in the election procedures, but also in language assistance before every election. Number 10, plan ahead and recruit extra bilingual poll workers. Poll workers invariably don't show up. You've got to have that backup poll. I see my time has elapsed. I've got 5 more points.
If you can just read them off, sure.
Okay, I will get through them. Number 11, use bilingual master poll workers, basically the best and the brightest to do quality control for the bilingual poll workers you have out in the polls. 12, publicize and engage in community outreach in the covered language. Voters can't know about the language assistance if you don't tell them. Number 13, have a dedicated toll-free number for language assistance. In the study that I attached, only 39% of all covered jurisdictions do this, but this tends to be one of the most important things to do as far as outreach and answer voter questions before Election Day. Number 14, solicit limited English proficient voter feedback. How well are we doing? Does the voter understand the materials? You don't know that unless you ask the voter. And then number 15, you have to conduct post-election assessments after every election to see what worked and to see what didn't. With that, I'll just turn your attention to the materials that I've already submitted, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. David Wallach.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is David Wallach. I'm with Everyone Counts. Everyone Counts is an elections vendor providing services and support both domestically and internationally. What you may have noticed is that I did not describe us as an elections equipment vendor. This is not because we don't provide elections equipment, but rather we identify as a software as a service model provider, or SaaS, giving our clients solutions that are available on commercial off-the-shelf hardware, or COTS. With my comments today, I'd like to highlight some advantages of the SaaS model, as well as bring to light some challenges that SaaS providers such as Everyone Counts face, that recommendations from this commission could help bring about change that would be beneficial both to voters and election officials. So, as I mentioned, service as a software has some distinct advantages over the traditional voting equipment that we are used to now. The first is that it's perpetually state-of-art. Technology is increasing at a geometric rate, and when we think of the life cycle of elections equipment, it can range from 4 to 6 years, sometimes 10 or more. If you think about your own personal technology, the computer you use now, the cell phone you use now, is vastly different than what you used 10 years ago, and yet in some jurisdictions we're still voting on equipment that was provided 10 years ago to be state-of-the-art at the time. The other advantage is that it runs on commercial off-the-shelf, as I mentioned. This is a big selling point as jurisdictions can reduce costs either by repurposing the equipment after an combining budgets with other departments. I've seen experimental budgeting where a Department of Education will work with an elections department and after an election send the tablets to a school. And so in that case, they can combine budgets and really reduce the cost on jurisdictions. The other thing is there is no proprietary equipment and in some cases no proprietary data formats where jurisdictions are held hostage by vendors. Training on familiar equipment can reduce costs for poll workers and voters. For example, most people would agree that we are familiar with tablets now, and being able to vote on a tablet such as an iPad, as was described by the Denver Elections Office commenter. I'm sorry. That program allows technology to go into spaces where people are used to the technology as opposed to an elections technology which is rolled out once a year. Voters are not familiar with it. Sometimes they don't even see it for 2 years if you have an all-mail election on an off year. Accessibility is a big issue that we're hearing about today, and SaaS model allows the expansion of accessibility. Voters can vote on their own devices that can either be brought to a poll place or they can do it at home and bring a pre-printed out sample ballot to a poll place, which would then be verified by them before an official ballot is submitted. These are all advantages. Some disadvantages to a SaaS model currently is that it's very hard to get certified as a software-only vendor. A lot of the certification standards are based on equipment specifications, and also a lot of the certification is written much slower than technology advances. And so there is a lag between what we call certifiable equipment and what is really available on the market today. For example, Everyone Counts offers a patent-pending quad audit voting system which produces 2 paper ballots and 2 electronic ballots, all independent of each other. This allows a jurisdiction to choose one as the vote of record and have 3 independent vote verification and or audit trails. However, at the moment, this system is not certified, although we are hoping to change that soon. And as I mentioned, the lack of the certification standards, while voluntary through the EAC at the moment, many states have local regulations that will stay with the EAC certification, which makes it very hard to certify new technology. I would like to end with a quote from Bill Gates. This was in 2005. He said, "The next sea of change that is upon us is a tectonic shift from single-use hardware and licensed software that organizations must install and maintain to a software as a service-based system." Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Ivy Soto.
Thank you, co-chairs, members of the commission. My name is Daniel Ivy Soto. Just a very brief history. I was general counsel to my state political party in 2000 in New Mexico when the state went. It was decided by 237 votes. I was the state elections director in New Mexico for a period of time. I served with Commissioners McGeehan and Thomas, and was also on the drafting and enactment committees for the Uniform Military and Overseas Voters Act as a Uniform Law Commissioner, where Commissioner Patrick was a very active observer and gave a tremendous amount of input. Currently, I'm the executive director for the county clerks in New Mexico, and in my spare time, I'm a state senator, where I serve as the vice chair of the Senate Rules Committee, which deals with election legislation. Just a couple of things that I wanted to mention. First of all, there was a question that was asked about the timing of when ballots are sent out. And I guess having been a candidate this year, I had suddenly a great revelation about the timing of when people are allowed to vote. And that is that the sooner you send out ballots, the sooner I have to peak and maintain, and all the way to Election Day. And what that does in New Mexico, we send out our ballots beginning 28 days before the election. I have to peak and maintain for an entire month. And whereas, by contrast, if we're able to, I love these jurisdictions that send it out maybe a week or 10 days later, but have it available to everybody at that point. Because that allows campaigns, quite frankly, to be able to focus their energies in terms of the crescendo of their election, in terms of the education that they're trying to provide to the voters and make sure that they get out there and get around to them. When HAVA was passed in 2002, there was a significant amount of money that was pushed out to the states, and there was some discussion today about the importance of that. I beg, as a recommendation, if it's at all possible, that there be a delay in when the money is made available from when we discuss how much it will be, so that we can allow some of these emerging technologies to get certified, so that we can allow some of these projects, like what Dean Logan is doing, to actually have products come to bear, instead of just having 2 or 3 companies that happen to have certified products be the only ones who are able to benefit from the billions of dollars that are pushed out to the states. And quite frankly, a requirement of checking with local election officials and not have all of this decided at the state level, at least make sure that there's input, is tremendously important. I would ask that this commission, even though I know it's not in your purview, you don't understand it to be in your purview at the moment, I'll follow up on what someone else said earlier today, that you consider voter ID, because it does have to do with the voter's experience in voting. It has to do with the voter's perception of the legitimacy of the process, and it has to do with the voter's ability to be able to cast their vote. I would also encourage you to take a look at the Michigan model. The Michigan model that requires people to present an ID, but if they don't have an ID, they can do a non-ID affidavit of their information, so you have a fallback. Now, frankly, if we were to have a system federally mandated where a picture ID, where you have to resemble your picture without worrying about what your expiration date is, because we're using the ID for a purpose other than the purpose for which it was issued. But then there's a fallback for someone who doesn't have an ID. That would be a system that would encourage people to be able to vote and would provide great confidence for a lot of voters when they do vote. I will also tell you, with the November election coming right after Halloween, as a former prosecutor, that is one of the biggest DWI arresting days of the year. Great booking pictures. And we have, and in a lot of states, people lose the officer takes away their driver's license at that point. Finally, I would encourage you to develop a philosophy of elections. Are elections the means by which office holders attain their position? Or are elections the ability of the people to express their voice? Depending on your philosophy of elections, the rules are vastly different. And thus, having a philosophy of elections, I think, will guide this commission in terms of the recommendations it makes and will help keep people from cherry picking from among your recommendations for particular agendas. Thank you very much.
That concludes the testimony for today. We want to
thank all of you for attending. We also want to repeat what Commissioner Ginsburg said earlier, which is that we accept and in fact welcome comments along the way. We have a website through which the comments can be submitted, and we are actively looking for more of your thoughts and additional reflections on the testimony provided today. So thank you very much, and with that, we'll adjourn.